Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a new session from Planet X Live. Today's session is in partnership with Doctors Without Borders, and we will talk about COVID-19 vaccine inequality. We hear people talk all the time about fair allocation and access to the COVID-19 vaccine. However, the term remains vague and, let's say, ignored by many countries around the world. Today, we are here to ask a question. Do all people around the globe have access to the vaccine equally? And if not, why? We will try to understand more and answer this question with our guests. We have here in the studio Mohammed Yahia, Executive Editor for MENA region at Springer Nature. Welcome back, Mohammed, to Planet X Live.
Thank you very much, Shala. Thank you. Very happy to be back.
Thank you. And later on, Dr. Isabelle Defourny, Director of Operation at Doctors Without Borders in France, will join the discussion. But for the time being, it's me and Mohammed. So let's talk about vaccine allocation and fair allocation and stuff like that. What do you think about, do people get equal access to vaccine around the world?
Well, I think it would be very hard for anyone to say yes to that question. I mean, as you see around the world right now, what's happening, it's really the majority, the vast majority of vaccines have been administered in a handful of countries. So we look at countries like the US, the UK, the UAE, Israel, and these countries have done so well. They have had such great programs to vaccinate their populations. And then you look at a different region, like say Africa, and it's a stark difference, right? Because so few people have been vaccinated, so few people have access to vaccines. When you listen to, for example, the US vaccinating 1 million people a day, and then compare that to countries that have not even received 20,000 doses of the vaccine, and you can see the stark difference that's there. So there's definitely a huge problem in vaccine access. And it's not really just between the global north and the global south. I mean, the vaccine access has been, well, not that good in the EU, for example. So it's a very global problem, and I think so far it's not been handled very well.
And I think Dr. Isabelle is joining us now. So welcome, Dr. Isabelle, to Planet X. Can you hear us? Dr. Isabelle? Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear us now? Dr. Isabelle, can you hear us? Okay, I think there is a technical issue. Can you hear us now, Dr. Isabelle? I think there's a technical problem, or the internet is, the connection is not fixed.
It's the new realities of a COVID-19 world.
Yes, exactly. So now, Dr. Isabelle, can you hear us? So we can you hear us, Dr. Isabelle? Okay. I think the internet connection is not fixed because I can't see her. So, until this technical issue is solved with Dr. Isabelle Mohammed, can you let us know how science journalism in the MENA region, for example, because this is where we live, how we handled what our role in shedding light about vaccine accessing and facilitating to all the countries?
It's an interesting question, right? So because I think I've always said this over the past year or so, that the pandemic has been a real test for science journalists. This is our biggest challenge yet, of everything we learned and how we can be a part of the solution, how we can solve, at least help solve the issue. And when it comes to vaccine, so last year it was a different challenge. Last year it was really trying to get the right information out, and this year the main challenge has been the vaccine. Talking about issues like vaccine accessibility and vaccine hesitancy, where people do not want to take the vaccine because they're worried or scared for whatever reason. I think that a lot of the focus has been on vaccine hesitancy rather than vaccine access when it comes to science journalism coverage. And that is probably driven by the fact that a lot of the work, the science journalism work, is being done in the West and then transferred to the MENA region. So, for example, you have stories published in regional outlets, but they would be Reuters stories or AP stories. They're not stories created by regional or local journalists focusing on the problems at home, really. So that's where the problem is. That's where the issue happened. So what I think what we failed to do very well is address the problems locally. So have a focus on what needs to be done locally to improve access. And with access, it comes down to country access, but also access for the groups that are most at risk, right? So you want healthcare workers to have access, you want the elderly to have access first. I don't think this has been tackled very well at the regional level. So you don't find Arabic stories, for example, that talk about this. Or the same in Africa. You don't find too many stories that address the issue of vaccine accessibility. And that's the problem. From the beginning, the whole problem has been that everything around COVID-19, the whole discussion has always been skewed towards the global north. That's where the focus has been. So that's why even when you talk about the problems with vaccine hesitancy is always much higher in the agenda, because that's a global north problem as well. It's not just happening in the global south. So that's why I think the problem is we don't have locally grown solutions, let's say, in science journalism for this.
Okay, so do you think that we need to address more vaccine hesitancy and actually push people to go and have the vaccine right now, more than to push governments to stop hoarding vaccines like some countries are doing right now?
Well, I mean, vaccine hesitancy, it's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed. But to be completely honest, I think that for many countries, including many in the MENA region and probably almost every single African country, hesitancy is not the number one problem. It's really having the vaccine in the first place. So, for example, if you have huge hesitancy in a country like, let's say, Lebanon, for example, just off the top of my head, if you have large hesitancy there, but the truth is there's already very little vaccine available. So the people who will be getting the vaccine are people who are not hesitant. Hesitancy is a problem when you have large access and there's a lot of people that you need to vaccine, and you should. But the problem is that people don't want to take it. The problem is here, it should focus on access in the first place. And obviously, a lot of countries in the north have created these bilateral deals with pharmaceutical companies that allow them to have access to the vaccine much earlier and in much larger quantities, which has crippled efforts like COVAX. But to be completely fair, there's also the issue of journalists holding their governments accountable for a healthcare system that is able to distribute the vaccine efficiently. So this problem becomes quite glaring if you look at war-torn countries like Yemen or Syria, for example. The problem there, yes, basically in these conflict zones, the problem becomes that the healthcare system has failed. It's collapsed. It's mostly collapsed. So how do you get vaccines to people? How do you get people to get their jab? And how do you make sure that it is not politicized, where one group would be getting the vaccine over another because they're aligned with the government or for whatever other reason? So these are the challenges that we need to address here. Obviously, the North, or the more developed world, if you'd say, needs to wake up to the fact that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So if you want, if a country is starting to vaccinate 30-year-olds when another country has not vaccinated its elderly, then that does not save that first country in any way, because in our globalized, really connected world, it doesn't work that way anymore. We just need everyone to have access to that vaccine. So that's why these are the things we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about how to hold our own governments accountable for the vaccines to reach the people, how to help them make sure that the vaccines reach the people that need them the most.
Okay, one of the challenges I met as a science journalist covering something like fair allocation for vaccine and access and equal access was reaching out for governments and spokesperson to talk about the efforts that the governments are doing to make vaccines available for their citizens. So what is your advice for journalists who are covering such topic to do when every call is unanswered and they can't reach out for government to speak up about their plans to make sure that everyone in their population gets vaccinated?
Well, that's one of the challenges that science journalists here face, right? I mean, with the whole vaccine, with the numbers, with the reported numbers, with access to with the number of vaccines that have been that arrived in a certain country, it's all, there's all those spoken mirrors that just block access to information, and that's the truth of it. But that's why it's very challenging to have journalism here. Journalism in the West is enshrined in certain rights. But we have to fight for these rights. We have to push. And if the governments are not able to provide those numbers, then investigative journalism is where we should be investing time and effort, because we need to tell the stories that people want to hear rather than the stories that officials or government representatives want. That's not the role of science journalism. Having said that, it's also often tricky to find this access and to find the right stories to tell, but you need to dig a little deeper. So, I mean, if you're looking at vaccine access, the issue right now in many countries extends far beyond the COVID-19 vaccine. That's only the tip of the iceberg. But the reality is we are going to pass through this really, really tough period of time, this pandemic, and on the other side, realize we have a disaster in vaccines for millions of children who have not been vaccinated for things like measles, which were normal, but they stopped because, well, manufacturing efforts have all been diverted to COVID-19. Access to vaccine has collapsed to all the different vaccines has collapsed in many countries. Countries like Yemen, for example, while COVID-19 is a very serious issue, it's not the only one it's not the only vaccine problem that they have. It's not the only thing they have to contend with. And these are the stories we science journalists should be telling. These are the things we should be exploring. It's always very easy to get the low-hanging fruit stories, the stories that everyone's talking about. But the edge is finding these stories that not everyone will be talking about, but that are very important and relevant to our communities.
Okay, so it's actually a very, very good opportunity because we are in World Vaccination Week. This week is a World Vaccination Week, and you have touched a very important point about how the efforts to develop a new COVID-19 vaccines have affected other vaccine efforts like measles and stuff like that. Did you see like good stories about this particular topic that shed the light about how COVID-19 vaccine that took all the light, all the funding, all the efforts, and affected the other efforts for vaccination?
Yes, there's been a lot of good coverage on that. It's really interesting when you dig in the data, because a lot of that data is very readily available through the UN and things like UNICEF, because they're very much involved in programs to vaccinate children in less developed countries, for example. Mm-hmm. So you can look at the numbers, you can look at the numbers coming out, and you realize that there's a story to be told there. But the one story that I would really that I think really hit home for me, and not, well, it's to be honest, it's a nature story, but it's not because I'm biased, but it was quite an interesting story that basically they looked at vaccine production in Africa, and Africa produces 1% of the vaccines that the country needs, and that's a very, very
how much again, please, Mohammed?
1%. So okay. You have a continent of 1.12 billion people, and they produce 1% of their vaccine needs. So Africa has to import approximately 99% of the vaccines that the continent needs, which is totally unacceptable. It should never be this way. That's
This is because there's no infrastructure or there's no calibers to do the efforts. What are the reasons behind that?
Well, the African CDC basically, and they've pledged to raise that to 60% by 2040, which is a great and ambitious and very important target that they should aim for. But to do that, they would need Africa would need to scale up manufacturing, manufacturing capacity, but also scale up research and research and development as well. There are huge opportunities here in Africa, and we have our own set of problems, and we should not expect other countries to solve those problems for us. Africa really has to turn inwards and try to solve its own problems. You've got an issue like malaria. Think what the world would be like with a malaria vaccine, for example. These are the kind of things we should be thinking about, we should be talking about. And Africa is poised to do that because there's a young, vibrant, energetic research community. It's a very young continent. Young researchers are amazing. They're doing great work with the resources that they have, and they're poised to take that forward. So upping vaccine production locally would solve a lot of the problem. And I think this is one of the things we've learned from this pandemic, right? That you have to be prepared. You can't just wing it when it happens, because this is what the world did this time, and it didn't go very well, as everyone can see. We're still locked at homes, and this has lasted much longer than we expect. And I think, I look at the terrible situation in India right now, and that's a stark reminder of why a lot of that work needs to be happening regionally and locally. Most of African vaccines come from India, and now there's a huge disaster happening in India, and they would need every single dose of the vaccine to counter that, which puts more strain on Africa as well because of expected delays in vaccination. So these are the kind of stories we should, I think, be exploring as science journalists.
So I'm just informing our audience that Dr. Isabelle Defourny won't be able to join us because of some technical issues, but we will have a very nice video by the end of the session she has made before about the same topic. So we will continue with Mohammed. I hope you are enjoying the session so far. And back to India, Mohammed. You were talking about that India, the biggest factory for developing vaccines are in India, and we saw how things went badly for them right now. And we were talking about that Africa, they are not developing enough, but you see what I mean, how India were developing a lot of vaccine and they have the biggest manufacturer, and they have gotten that bad. The situation there is so bad, and how this didn't help them to survive. Is it because of the culture against vaccine, or the accessibility, or because they just were? I need to know what the reason behind that.
Well, a lot of researchers are trying to understand why it went so bad for India right now. But I think from what we know so far, and it could be, like I said, this is something that researchers are looking at right now. But from what we know so far, it's just a mixture that brewed the perfect storm, basically. So Yes, India produces a large number of vaccines. Like I said, the Serum Institute of India is the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world. It was producing the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what COVAX was depending on was going to come from that manufacturer. But what happened with India is, first of all, it's a huge country. It's got a population of over 1 billion people. And while they were rolling out their vaccine program, it was not fast enough. It was not reaching people fast enough. Not due to hesitancy, but because of the large number and the healthcare system that was stretched. And that is coupled with loosening of a lot of the constraints that were put in place to limit the spread of the vaccine. So a very large Hindu religious event took place. People were not, there were political rallies taking place across the country, etc.
So they basically let down their guards.
Yeah, they let the guard down, and the virus is very opportunistic. That's the perfect time to make a comeback, and that's why it is it's particularly so scary with that virus.
Yes, and actually we can see is the same pattern in some countries in the region, for example, Egypt. And now we are in Ramadan, and all the events, all the iftars, all the stuff, and just India came as a reminder that we can do that, at least not now, until everyone is vaccinated and we are a little bit safe. So back to COVAX, do you think that some journalists let COVAX down by not covering their efforts enough? Because let's face it, COVAX is not doing the progress it should have done, or according to their plans.
I'm not sure. I mean, how would you say science journalism has let COVAX down? I mean, I would argue that science journalism has maybe not held COVAX to account as much as it should. I don't think we understood, a lot of us, we understood COVAX very well in the beginning. For example, I've had people call me up confused on why Canada was getting vaccines from COVAX, for example, when it's a developed country with a very healthy stockpile of vaccine that was being rolled out, even if it's a bit slower than expected. But these are the kind of questions that came up. Obviously, I think COVAX is a wonderful idea. I think it was undermined by all the bilateral deals that were done. I think where science journalists have not invested enough is in explaining to people, especially in the global north, why, for very selfish reasons, it's important for them to make sure that the global south is vaccinated. I mean, it's, like I said, it doesn't have to be altruistic. It's really because safety means that everyone has to be safe. Mutations for the virus are very real. New variants keep coming up. And this is true of every single virus. So this is not something strange or something peculiar or something unique to SARS-CoV-2. It's just the way viruses work. And the more infections that happen, the more there's the higher chance there is that mutations will arise. So if we let the virus continue rampant in certain countries, we're just creating the perfect playground for the virus to evolve and just.
And the new variants, like the ones we saw in England and in South Africa, it's because of the numbers.
Exactly. So these are very real reminders. We still are trying to understand these new variants and how they relate and how they affect the efficacy of the vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
But this will continue. It's not going to end anytime soon, as long as the virus keeps spreading. And the best way to stop that spread is through vaccination. It's the best tool we have in our arsenal. That's the truth of it. It is our strongest weapon.
Okay. There is always a saying in science journalism that put a human face to the stories so people can relate to it. So what kind of story you would like to write about the fair access to COVID-19 vaccine? Or you would like to see in the MENA region science journalism platforms?
I would really like to see stories that, stories from a place like Yemen or the northern or northwestern regions of Syria, which are not under government control. I'd really like to have stories to hear how people are coping there, how access to vaccine has been affected there, and really to look at the children. I mean, this is, for me, it always comes down to that, to look at the children there and have they been vaccinated or not for diseases that were very commonly vaccinated for in the past. Like I said, when I think of vaccine accessibility, I think the story is much bigger than COVID-19. We'll start to realize that in a year or two. I think we'll start to see a lot of diseases make ugly comebacks because of poor vaccination progress for various reasons. But one of them is really the healthcare systems that are able to reach these people. Often in a country like Egypt, when you look at vaccine coverage, all the stories are really about Cairo or Alexandria. And I would like to hear the stories from little villages in the south that usually have a very small clinic that services the whole village. Do they have access to the vaccine or not? What is it like there? And not just for the COVID-19 vaccine, but like I said, for other vaccines during this period of time. Are there children getting vaccinated or not? These are the kind of stories I'd like to see. It's the people that we don't normally see. And that's been the problem with COVID-19. Like I said, number one, you get coverage from the US, the UK, the EU. Then on the second level, you have developed countries or richer countries like China, South Korea, etc. And then there are very few stories about Africa. And then there are even rarer stories about the regions in Africa that are often forgotten. So
Okay.
this is the disparity we have in coverage, and it very closely mimics the disparity in vaccine access as well.
Mhm. Sometimes I think when you say it like that, sometimes I think if there are well-developed countries with robust healthcare system and they are struggling with distributing vaccine to their population or giving access to the vaccine for their population. We saw that in many European countries, for example. So I always find myself wonder, what about conflict zones that has no healthcare system at all, or a very broken system? Actually, the refugees that they live in tents in foreign countries and they have minimal healthcare system. I always wonder what they are doing, how they are handling the whole pandemic thing on top of everything else that they are suffering. So I think we need to shed more light about topics like about people like that, what they are doing. We really don't know. I saw like couple of articles about this, and no more. I think this is the rule of science journalism, is to give voice for the people who can speak for themselves and let them be heard by the governments and the international institutions.
I absolutely agree, and
yeah.
and I think if you go down to that level, you will find stories, inspirational stories of heroes who make this happen, right? I mean, you'd have to have visited places, at least in Africa, to start to imagine how different it is to deliver a dose of the measles vaccine to Germany than it is to deliver it to a village in Sierra Leone, for example. It's a completely different journey, completely different a voyage, and it is an incredible story to be able to tell.
Yeah, I can imagine now when you say the journey in Germany and in Sierra Leone. I can imagine the whole thing, and it would be a really visually rich story to be told. And one other aspect I would like to ask you about is the conflict of the conflicted information that science journalists are receiving all the time about vaccine, about the research is doing, because we all know that the vaccine development and distribution is always work in progress for all institutes all over the world. And we always have a conflicted message. This works, no, it doesn't. Like, for example, Pfizer vaccine, it was said that it needs to be you have to have a cold chain to be reserved and stuff like that. And then they came up and said, no, we don't need that much degree to keep it working. So how science journalists have to deal with this contradictory information all the time and to report on it to their audience?
It's the challenge we've had since the beginning of the pandemic, really, because information keeps changing. We keep learning new things. Today, we know more about the virus than we did at this same time last year, when we practically knew almost nothing. So our messages keep changing, and I understand that for a lot of people this is frustrating and it can erode the trust in what we do, but we have to keep pushing that this is just the nature of reporting on something as it unfolds right now. It's a pandemic. It's a new thing that we are not sure of. Things will keep coming up. We just need to be very vigilant in putting things into their proper context and in always referring to what we know right now from the science. This is the only reference we have, really. So it's not 100% accurate, but it is the best estimate we have. We just don't have any other tools. What the science tells us is the best that we as humanity know at this point in time. It will change, it will evolve by time, and I suspect that by this time next year, we will have different vaccines, and these different vaccines will be more efficient, be more accessible, easier to transport, etc. The vaccine will keep evolving. I have no doubt of that. But we have to deal with what we know right now. So, for example, with something like Pfizer, the messenger RNA or mRNA technology that was used, it's just so new, it's so modern. It's not something we've done before. This is the first vaccine we've ever developed with this kind of technology. It's breaking edge technology. It has enormous potential in so many different ways beyond vaccines. It's such a really powerful technology, but this is what we know of it so far, and that's why messages keep changing a bit. We have to explain that to our audiences as well. Explain that this is the nature of the process, and while the information we have right now is not perfect, it's probably better than any other source that they will be looking into.
Exactly. We have, because we will introduce a video for Dr. Isabelle Defourny by the end of the session. We got one question from Maria Hamid. She says there's an indication that we might face India's tragedy in Egypt. How can science journalism help avoid this fate?
That's an interesting question. Personally, yes, I think there are a lot of indications that there's potential that the same issues that have happened with India could happen elsewhere in a place like Egypt, because a lot of the constraints have also been lifted. And I think Alia is perfectly on spot. This is right now, science journalists should be looking into how to address that. But we do not, the problem is that journalism has not been very robust in Egypt for the past few years. And this is exactly why we need to have robust media that can, journalism that can hold people accountable and bring about change. And you bring about change by communicating to politicians, but also by communicating to the public if communicating to the government fails. So there is definitely a need to inform the public and to inform people that there is a danger. We're not out of the waters yet by far. We do not have enough vaccination to be safe in any way or to be comfortable in any way or to let down our guard. So my advice for science journalists here would be to aim for that and to compare what is happening. I mean, we keep getting lessons from many different places, and the lessons are good and bad, right? So you can look at the graphs of a country like the UK and how new cases have fallen drastically over the past couple of months, and compare that to the graphs of the numbers we have in Egypt, even though these are completely inaccurate. And then you can also compare what happened in a country like India and the extremely high peak we are seeing right now in infections and deaths from COVID-19, and compare that to when exactly the restrictions were lifted, and you get an idea. And I think good advice, I mean, I think this is usually very useful because we're very visual creatures. You look at these graphs and you don't need to read a whole article anymore. It just strikes you. This is what it looks like. This is where we could be heading, or this is where we could be heading. We could be heading towards lower infections if we take these steps, which I understand are terrible. People are fed up. People need to go out, but it saves lives. Or this is the different direction you can take, and you can end up with an explosion of infections and new cases. And putting this in context to people, it can help people to change their mind. Having said that, it's really governments that I think have the highest effect in controlling behaviors, because they can put rules in place. So that's also part of where the communication should be going to from science journalists. We should be communicating to governments that maybe what you're doing is not enough. Maybe there needs to be more in order to protect people, because we're talking about lives here. It's yes, of course, livelihood is affected by closures, but lives, much more lives can get affected by an explosion of infections.
Thank you, Mohammed, for being with us today with all your input in this very crucial topic. We had Mohammed Yahia, Executive Editor at MENA region at Springer Nature, with us today in the studio of Planet X Live. Thank you, Mohammed, for coming.
No, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
And thank you all for watching. And now we will leave you with a video about vaccine facilitation and access inequality from Dr. Isabelle Defourny from Doctors Without Borders. I'm sharing it with you now, and I will leave the link at the comments as well. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and see you in the next Planet X live session.
La seconde chose sur laquelle on a travaillé, c'est finalement se mettre en contact avec les différents fabricants pour voir les différents fabricants, pour voir si vraiment il y avait une possibilité pour nous d'acheter ces vaccins et de mettre à disposition des États avec l'idée finalement de faire un complément de gros mécanismes COVAX qui sont en place. Et là, aujourd'hui, dans nos hôpitaux, environ la moitié des cas et la moitié des décès ont moins de 60 ans. Donc, c'est pas la même chose que ici en France, par exemple. Plus de 95% des décès ont plus de 65 ans. Dans nos hôpitaux, l'âge de décès est plus jeune, quand même, de 60 ans. J'ai l'impression qu'il y a un effort à faire, trop court finalement. Personne ne s'attendait à arriver ces vaccins enregistrable par l'autorité de régulation américaine ou l'autorité de régulation européenne. Maintenant, pour les humanitaires, il s'agit d'être attentif par rapport à ce que tu disais de la situation de Paris, parce que parfois le Paris, c'est pas seulement ton maladie. Le Paris, c'est pas seulement fonction